Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. I was blind, but now I see.
This morning we're going to be diving into the book of Genesis and the story of Hagar. And to give you a little bit of context, the book of Genesis is the first book in the Bible, and it describes the beginning of all things, of God creating the world and everything in it, including humans. And in the beginning, everything is good and people live in right relationship with God. There's this closeness and intimacy with God. But God also creates humans with the choice to decide if they want to trust God or they're going to be autonomous and go about their own way of deciding what is good and evil. And when humans decide to be autonomous, to rebel against God, to go about things their own way, sin enters the world. There's a breakdown of their relationship to God and their relationship to each other. And if you were to go through the beginning chapters of Genesis, what you would notice is like the ripples of their rebellion, the consequences, are getting bigger and bigger. like the cracks are spreading, because first they're distrusting God, and then the next chapter, brother kills brother. So now God goes about trying to redeem and restore wholeness to the world. He has a redemptive plan. And what's a little bit surprising about this plan is that he partners with humans to do it. And so later in the story, God enters into this special relationship with this man, Abram. He goes to Abram and says, leave your land and your relatives and go into the land that I'm going to show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you so you can be a blessing. And later, God promises that Abram will have as many offspring as there are stars in the sky. But now in chapter 16, conflict starts to build when his wife, Sarai, has not been able to have children despite the time that has passed in God's promise. So in verse 1, it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. Abram replied, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. So in this situation, Sarai has not been able to have children. And so her and Abram abuse Hagar. They use Hagar, this woman, as a tool to help them have a child. They rob her of her agency. Notice that neither of them mention Hagar's name in the text. And when things do not go well, when there are consequences, again, ripples of Sarai's decision, things get worse. And the Hebrew word, this text was originally written in Hebrew, that describes how Sarai responds, the way she treats Hagar so harshly, it's actually the same word that describes how the Egyptians later treat Hebrews when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. It describes oppression, abuse. So Hagar flees. Hagar, a pregnant woman, is alone, trying to make her way through the wilderness to her home in Egypt, unsure of how people will respond when she gets there, unsure of what her life will be like for her and her son, navigating the shame because of how she has been treated, because of how Abram and Sarai have treated her. She is in a very vulnerable situation. So as the story continues, verse 7, it says, an angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord. who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Bir Lahairoi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. So Hagar, in a very painful and vulnerable situation in the wilderness, has an encounter with God. And a couple things I want to note about this interaction. This angel of the Lord uses her name and promises her something that resembles the promise and the relationship that God had with Abram. And Hagar, because of this experience, gives God a name, the God who sees. Hagar is the only person in the Bible to give God a name like that. The God who sees. We all hopefully have had experiences where someone sees us. It's like they totally understand us, and maybe it even catches us off guard because it doesn't happen all the time. I remember this was years ago. It was a Saturday, and I was in a situation that was causing me a lot of anxiety. But it was a full day. I had a timeline and something that I had to get done. And so I just didn't have time to process and go through some practices that would have been really helpful for me. In fact, I actually had to go to Costco, which is like not where you want to be if you're having anxiety. And I parked in the back of the parking lot because it was full, and I started walking into Costco, and I had my hand on my chest, my sunglasses on, and I was just breathing, just slowly trying to make myself feel grounded and safe as I walked through this busy parking lot. And I remember this man like darted through people to come and approach me, and he said, "Miss, are you okay?" And I was like, I wasn't really doing anything to draw attention to myself. I was really caught off guard that of all the people in this parking lot, he somehow saw me and knew that I wasn't okay. And he said, "I've just learned that people who look like that usually aren't okay." And he had a veteran's hat on. So I just wondered if he himself had been familiar with what anxiety looks like and feels like, or if he knew someone who had. And I felt so blessed and grounded by that interaction that so much of my anxiety just ceased. This is really small, I think, in comparison to how Hagar experiences God. The situation was very different, and yet I wonder if it really caught her by surprise that God met her in this space. It might have caught her by surprise, but this is consistent with who God is. God binds up the brokenhearted. God hears the cries and liberates people who are oppressed. God is near. When we are stuck, when we are in a situation where we're stripped of our security or aspects of our identity, whether it be a job loss, a divorce, a diagnosis, God is near. God sees. And because that is who God is, something about this interaction that she has with the angel is a bit unsettling to me. I don't really understand why the angel tells Hagar to go back to this situation, to go back to a situation that has been hurtful and harmful and abusive for her. I actually have sat with this question for quite a while, not only in this sermon writing process, but other times in my life when I read this story. Like, this just doesn't seem consistent with who God is. And while I still don't completely understand this, there are some aspects to this story that I think are important to recognize, or at least bring to mind as we sit in this tension. One thing is, it's possible or likely that maybe Hagar never would have made it to Egypt. As a woman alone in the wilderness, maybe her life was at risk. It's also notable that as the story continues, Sarah isn't mentioned again in this chapter. So maybe there is some kind of resolve in her. The dynamic has changed. Hagar gives birth to a son. His name is Ishmael, just like God promised. And then later, years later, when conflict erupts again between Sarai and Hagar, because Sarai now has a son and Hagar's son is much older, she once again forces Hagar out. And Hagar once again finds herself in a vulnerable situation in the desert, mourning the death she anticipates of her son. And God once again hears their cries and provides for them. And the story actually ends with Hagar finding a wife for Ishmael, which points to her agency, but also a restoration of her security and her place in a fulfillment of God's promises. Even still, with those things in mind, I don't completely understand why God tells her to go back, because God is a God who hears the cries of people who are oppressed and liberates them. And I trust in God's character, even though I don't understand this part of the story. So what are we to learn or take away from Hagar's story? I think there are two takeaways, but really one, because they're connected. We didn't really dive into why Sarai made this decision. And it would be easy to assume that, well, she wanted a son and she didn't trust God to provide that for her. So she went about a horrible way of establishing that for herself. But I think the situation is a bit more complex than that, because in this culture and context, shame was piled on women who couldn't have a child. And having a son was not only part of the joy of being a mother, but it was also a way of establishing security. Women who had a son, it was like their status within the family or the village was somehow raised up. It was as though her worth and identity was really connected to having children. And so I imagine that what Sarai is navigating is not only a desire to be a mom and have a kid, but the shame and the fear of what will happen if she doesn't. Her strategy to give her husband a son is not just a reflection of a lack of trust in God. It's a reflection of a desire to increase her social status, sense of self-worth, and also economic security. It's also important to recognize that earlier in this story, Abram treats Sarai in a way that is very similar to how Sarai treated Hagar. As they're on their journey with God, they arrive in Egypt, and Abram is so afraid because Sarai is very attractive. And so he's worried that they're going to kill him to have Sarai. And so he says, let's just tell them that you're my sister. And so they do, and she's taken into Pharaoh's palace, and who knows what happens there. And so Sarai's actions in some way reflect her participating in a cycle of harm that's been done to her. And that's not to excuse her own responsibility in the abuse and the harm that she caused Hagar. She made that choice. But it reminds me of a quote by Carl Jung, the famous psychologist. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." Maybe Sarah didn't want to face her own soul. And very similarly, Peter Rollins, who's a philosopher that I followed for a while, I heard him say on a podcast once that someone always pays for your inability to confront yourself. Now, maybe we don't experience this truth to this extreme, but I'm sure you could bring to mind a time when you lashed out at a coworker or a family member because of something that you were going through, shame that you were experiencing, humiliation, anger, or hurt. Maybe you can think of times when people have approached you wanting to grow closer to you or help you with something, but you disappoint them and push them away because you're afraid to trust, because of previous experiences. Maybe you notice patterns in your own conflict and the way that you respond to conflict that are reflective of the ways that your family handled conflict. Maybe you avoid it, pretend like everything's fine because that's what your family did, even if that's not what's most needed in the situation. Someone always pays for our inability to confront ourselves. Can you imagine what would have happened if Sarai had gone to God first? If she had gone to God and said, "I'm so afraid. I desperately want a child. I really want a child, and I'm afraid you're not going to come through with your promise, and I'm afraid of what that's going to mean for me. I'm afraid I won't have a place in this family. I'm afraid of how Abram looks at me like I'm worthless because I haven't been able to have a child. And who will take care of me? Who will take care of us in our old age?" I imagine that maybe this cycle of harm could have ended if Sarah had confronted herself. Rich Villodas, a pastor and author, said, "In a traumatized world, loving well starts with confronting or facing ourselves, which in turn enables us to relate differently towards others. In short, the person we must learn to love is ourselves, primarily. It's very easy to focus on the traumas of others, and there's a place for that too. But first, we're called to open our own hearts to the personal healing available in God's love." Facing ourselves, allowing God to see us as Hagar allows God to see her, positions us to be conduits of love. So I invite you into some reflection this morning. Is there something within your heart or your soul? It could be a fear. It could be disappointment. It could be shame of feeling like you're not enough, or you don't belong, or you're not worthy. Is there something within yourself that you would like to face? Something you would like to allow God to see? I invite you to spend some time inviting God to show you if there's any place that He would like to see and offer you compassion. Let me say a prayer for us. God, we are grateful that you see us, that you long for healing and wholeness, that you come to us with love and compassion. I pray that each of us would experience that this morning in a unique way. Pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you, we worship you. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Yes, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are here, turning lives around. I worship you, we worship you. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. Never stop, never stop. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Yes, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Love is devoted, like a ring of solid gold, like a vow that is tested, like a covenant of old. Your love is enduring through the winter rains, beyond the horizon, merciful today. Faithful you have been, faithful you will be. Pledge yourself to me, and that's why I sing your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Father, the orphan, your kindness makes us whole. You shoulder our weakness, and your strength becomes our own. You're making me like you, clothing me in white, bringing beauty from ashes. That you will have your bride, free of all her guilt, rid of all her shame, and known by her true name. And it's why I sing your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. You will be praised, you will be praised. Angels and saints we sing, worthy are you, Lord. You will be praised, you will be praised. Angels and saints we sing, worthy are you, Lord. And it's why I sing your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips. Your praise will ever be on my lips, ever be on my lips.
River Church community, let me send you with this blessing. To God be the glory, and to the earth peace. And to you, courage. Courage to face what is in your soul, that you might receive more of God's love and be a conduit of His love. Amen.